not something that we can really alter, but it highlights how complex our system is in terms of the information that we use or that we take in about food. So there are some genetic influences on the taste receptors that we have. So for instance, the way that our tongue and our brain link together to process the flavors that we encounter. So I think cilantro is a really good example of this. Cilantro can be a very polarizing flavor. Some people love it and think it tastes delicious. Other people think it's horrible and tastes like soap. And so the one influence on whether you are in the yummy group or the soap tasting group are these genetic differences in the taste receptors that we have. So this is one influence on, just one influence on the development of early food preferences. Okay, in addition to these kinds of, maybe genetic or more biological factors, there are also some common preferences that we observe across people of lots of different ages. They tend to emerge pretty early in development, and then we also observe across a lot of different communities and societies. And so some of these really common ones are preferences for sweet, salty, and familiar flavors, and a disliking of bitter flavors. Okay, so one reason why we think that we have these early food preferences that we can even see emerging when, in infancy, is preferences for instance, sweet flavors. And a lot of these common preferences are related to our ability to survive. So for instance, sweet and salty foods have more calories, and these are important for growth and survival. In particular, in kind of our earlier history as humans, when food availability was really different from what we see in our modern food environment. So it was really advantageous for us to like sweet foods because they weren't necessarily that abundant, and they would give us the calories that we would need to grow and survive. And we can even see some evidence of this, in today's world by looking at things like growth spurts. So for instance, in one study that looked at adolescents' preferences for sweet tastes, they found that adolescents who preferred flavors that were sweeter, so for instance, solutions with different amounts of sugar in them, adolescents who preferred the sweeter versions of that solution were more likely to have more of a marker of bone growth in their urine. And so that's kind of a byproduct of the growth process, and having more of that was associated with a preference for sweeter tastes. But also even, in childhood, we see a really strong preference for sweet tastes. Children tend to prefer sweeter flavors than even adults do. And we also see this very commonly across people and across communities. And in addition, some preferences for familiar flavors and disliking of things that are bitter may have also been important for our survival. So if we've eaten something and it tastes familiar to us, we might like it because we know that it's not poisonous, right? We ate it before, we didn't drop dead, and that might be something that's safe for us to eat in the future. If you've ever had an experience of being sick, you might have an aversion to that food even long after you've gotten over that illness because the ties between that feeling of sickness and those flavors are really strong. Similarly, bitter flavors can sometimes be dangerous. So they might indicate that a food is poisonous, and that might really encourage us to spit it out or not like it. And so that could be true for things that are actually poisonous, but even, some of those preferences might spill over into things that we think of as, not poisonous, or maybe even better, something that's healthy. Okay, so in addition to these genetic influences and these common preferences across people, we also just see a lot of individual differences. And there's a ton of variability that's not really explained or well understood. So just to give a really personal example, I hate peanut butter. I'm not really sure why. Like, this is a very commonly beloved food, but personally, it's something that I really dislike. I never had a bad experience with it. Just ever since I was a little kid, I really didn't like it. I guess maybe I like it a little bit better if it's like mixed up with chocolate, but I think that has more to do with chocolate than anything else. But, our food preferences, despite the fact that we have a lot of commonalities, we also have a ton of individual variability and also variability across different cultures. And so one key piece that I'm especially interested in my own work is the extent to which children learn about food from other people. And so this is a really big area of research across all different kinds of items, so not just foods, but I'm especially interested in how children learn about food from other people. And so there are several ways that our social context and the messages that children receive from other people influence their food preferences. So one of these is branding and marketing. So children tend to prefer foods that have popular brand labels, so brand labels that maybe are familiar to them and well-liked, and popular characters. So I actually saw these apples at Costco recently. They're just apples, but they have, this picture of Mickey Mouse on them. And I think each individual apple also has a little sticker with Mickey Mouse on them. And I think one of the goals, recently in the health promotion literature has been to try and harness these tendencies that marketers have known about for a long time to try and increase children's willingness to eat healthier foods as opposed to just, junk food or snacks. So I've been seeing this more and more on different foods, that are marketed towards children, and in particular, more of them apply to foods that we might think of as healthy. Children also pay attention to what other kids are eating. So like many other aspects of their learning or their interests, pretty early in development, certainly even as early as the preschool years, children are paying attention to what other kids are eating and are also interested in eating those foods. So in a really classic study by Leanne Birch, they arranged for children in a preschool setting to be seated together based on their food preferences. So before the start of the study, they surveyed all the kids in the classroom and tried to get an understanding of their food preferences. And then they would seat kids at a table with other kids whose preferences were different. So for instance, if this child said that they liked carrots but not peas, they would be seated with this child who likes peas but not carrots, and this child who likes peas but not carrots. And over a period of a few days, they found that this this one child that I'm spotlighting here, their preferences changed across a period of 4 days. So after 4 days of sitting with these other kids who had different preferences from them, their liking of, for instance, peas improved a little bit after seeing other kids who like to eat them. And so this is something I was really interested in my own work, because even though this seems like a really promising finding, this isn't something that parents can just implement on their own, right? You can't just, especially right now, you can't just like call up your kids' friends and have them over and, seat your kid with kids with other food preferences. Like that's not really something that people can do. And so I was wondering if we could just kind of tell kids about these preferences and if that would influence kids' food choices. So we brought kids into the lab and we provided them with 2 samples of the exact same food. So the food that's in this yellow bowl is actually the same food that's in this green bowl. And we just described it to them differently. So we told kids that, for instance, this food in the yellow bowl is really popular with other kids, and that this food in the green bowl is not popular with other kids. And we were interested in whether kids would eat more of this food just based on that description that we gave. And if we could kind of repeat that finding where kids are influenced by their peers' preferences, but without actually bringing in real kids, because that's not really something that people can do on a regular basis. And that's exactly what we found. We found that kids tended to eat more of the food that we described as being popular compared to the food that we described as being unpopular. And in a follow-up study, we found that this was really specific to foods that are popular with other kids. So you could imagine that kids just thought, well, the unpopular food tastes yucky, so I'm not going to eat that one. But when we described one food as being popular with kids and the other food as being popular with grown-ups, we found a similar pattern. They ate more of the food that we told them was popular with other kids compared to the food that was popular with grown-ups, even though both of them were described pretty positively. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that, I got to some questions from the group. I really appreciate that, some of you sent questions already. And so I'm going to start with this one. So this question came in from someone who has a 3-year-old son who's become very picky since he started eating on his own. He eats very few fruits and no veggies. We never pressure him and try to never draw attention to it, but it's hard. I thought I would break down a couple different aspects of this question and tell you a little bit more about, kind of what I think about this situation and what I know from research might be helpful or not helpful to maybe encourage kids to eat more vegetables. And just acknowledging that this is really challenging. And so the first thing I would start by saying is that you're definitely not alone. Disliking vegetables is a very typical experience. Tons of parents face this. And one reason why is because of what I described previously, that kind of natural disliking of bitter flavors is something that's really common and maybe had in previous generations maybe had some survival value, right? It helped us avoid eating things that were poison. But today where most of us aren't kind of out in the woods foraging, maybe is not super helpful to us. Okay, so you're definitely not alone. Disliking vegetables is extremely typical. Another point that I wanted to bring out is age. So this person who submitted this question has a 3-year-old son, and picky eating is very common during this period. So some studies have found that 40 to 60% of preschool age children, so just this age that the child is in, are classified as picky eaters. So these might be kids who avoid a food just by looking at it, kids who dislike a lot of foods. Maybe a parent might classify the child as being difficult to please with meals. Those are the kinds of questions that people have used to classify kids as picky eaters or not. Okay, so again, this is an extremely common experience, and particularly at this age group. So maybe even, half of kids at this age are picky eaters. And sometimes this is a temporary phenomenon, right? So some kids grow out of this and become more adventurous eaters and are happy to eat lots of different things just a few years later. But sometimes that's not true. Many children kind of continue this tendency towards picky eating beyond this preschool period. And so especially when you're at the beginning of it, it can be really stressful not knowing how long it's going to last for. And even if it's just for a few years, just for a few years, that's a long time, right? That's going to impact your day-to-day experience for a while. Okay, so another point that I wanted to highlight is this point that they never pressure the child to eat vegetables. And I think that's a positive. At this stage, pressuring and restriction are not always very effective, especially for these types of foods, compared to something like a sweet food that we worry about children eating too much of. Okay, and then another piece of this that I really wanted to highlight is how the person who sent in this question ends this, but it's hard. And I totally agree. Few studies that look at picky eating actually address the experience of parents who are trying to handle this experience on a daily basis. And so for many children who are picky eaters, they are still in what might be described as kind of a typical growth range, right? So they're not malnourished, they're not underweight. And so sometimes this issue doesn't receive clinical attention because the child is still by their pediatrician considered to be healthy. But that doesn't mean it's not a stressful experience for parents. And this is an area that I'm really interested in exploring in more detail because I think that this is a very stressful thing that parents experience. Okay, so those are the pieces of the question itself that I wanted to highlight. And then, I have one last piece that I wanted to highlight. This point of trying to never draw attention to it. I think it's good to not draw attention to what a child isn't eating or a refusal to eat, right? You don't want to make that a big deal or a sticking point every day. But I would try and draw their attention to these foods in positive ways. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to do that. So a few strategies to encourage, and then I'd also include in this list maybe some things not to do that might seem like a natural strategy. One thing that I would avoid doing is linking eating vegetables to some kind of reward. So for instance, eat your vegetables and you'll get dessert later, or having more TV or iPad time. This is a strategy that, while it might feel very natural to offer, and in the moment you might be very tempted to do, studies have shown that it isn't a very effective strategy. It's not going to encourage kids to really like vegetables themselves, and it might not have a lot of long-term effectiveness. So the next time you offer vegetables, it's not that kids are going to be excited to eat them. They're just always going to want that reward if that's how you connect it together. Another thing I would encourage is to keep trying. It can be really easy to feel defeated and like, well, what's the point? My kid's never going to eat this. But one thing that we do know is that repeated exposure to foods promotes liking. And this can sometimes take a lot of exposures to accomplish. So some studies have found that it might take 8 to 10 exposures to a food in order for kids to start liking it, even a little bit more than they did before. I would also say, it's good to keep trying, but I wouldn't necessarily try to do this on a stressful day, right? So if you've had a long day at work, if you've been going through something else stressful on that day, maybe that's not the day to try and offer vegetables. If everyone's already kind of stressed out, I wouldn't necessarily add to the stress of the day in the moment by really trying hard to get your kids to eat vegetables. I know it's tempting to really want them to eat vegetables every day, to start, that process of building healthy habits. But some days it's just maybe too much for everybody. Another thing that I think could be really helpful is to eat these foods yourself and show that you like it. So children tend to copy enthusiastic models. So whether it's other children or teachers or other people in their environment, they tend to copy the behaviors that they see other people do enthusiastically. And they take in that information. If they see you liking those foods, that might help them be a little bit more interested in them. And in my own work, I find that children tend to eat more food if they've seen their parents also eating more of that food. So this is in an observational context. I haven't tried to encourage parents to do this and then seen what the results are. But at least that's one indication to me that that might be helpful. And then a last strategy that also comes from some work that I've done is, as much as makes sense for you on a particular day or for your family, is to involve children in food preparation. And so this comes from a study I did where I gave children an opportunity, also in a lab context, to prepare food. So kids came into the lab and they were assigned to either prepare a salad, like this picture that you see on top, or to prepare a dessert. So for each one, they had little cups of different ingredients, and they could put as much of each ingredient that they wanted into the food. And then they were offered that food or a very similar food that they didn't see being prepared to eat. So we had a research assistant on the other side of a two-way mirror, and they tried to, watch closely while the child prepared their food and tried to put kind of as much of those ingredients as the child did in the alternative. And what we found is that children tended to eat a higher proportion of the food that they made themselves compared to the food that was just served to them. And we found this in both the salad condition, where children came in and made a salad, and in the dessert condition, where children came in and made a dessert. So I would especially emphasize this for healthy foods that you want your children to eat more of, as opposed to things that they like already. Certainly, it's always a fun activity to, bake or prepare desserts at home. But one thing to kind of keep in mind is that they might be even more excited to eat it than they would otherwise. But especially for things that you don't think they'd be especially excited to eat, maybe involving them in the food preparation process, even in a small way, like asking them to toss the salad together if that's in their skill set, asking them to sprinkle something on top, think about what stage your child is at. So we did this study with 5 and 6-year-old children. Everything was already cut up, so we didn't have them doing very heavy duty food preparation. So this isn't something that's necessarily going to be helpful to you to get dinner on the table, but might get them a little bit more engaged in the process. So again, I would judge, what's the right day to do this? Maybe not a day that's super stressful, but to the extent that you can and it makes sense for you, involving them in the food preparation process might make them even just a little bit more excited to try something new, or to try something that maybe they hadn't been as interested in before. Okay, so I really appreciated that question. It had a lot of components that I wanted to share with everybody, and I thought it was a really, it's a question that I hear a lot from parents. Okay, so here's another question. There's definitely some overlap here in terms of wanting to eat more vegetables. So this question was, how do I get my child to eat more vegetables? She can eat her weight in fruit, but refuses most vegetables. The only 3 I can get her to eat are tomatoes in a sauce, edamame from the pod, or corn on the cob. And again, I think this has a lot of echoes of the previous question where, maybe they have some interest in eating fruits, but, the key issue is eating vegetables here. And I highlighted the ones in particular that this child seems willing to eat. And one thing that I would emphasize here is to try and build on what works already and then expand from there. So if you're putting a sauce together, maybe add some carrots that might kind of blend in with the tomato sauce, or try green beans along with the edamame and highlight some similarities, right? So that's another green thing that comes in a pod and has some beans in it. So I would start with things that are as similar to the things that your child already likes, or even things that might be similar to the fruits that they like, right? So a squash that tastes sweet, or sweet potatoes might be a starting place to move towards things that maybe are less naturally exciting to kids. And another point around this that I wanted to highlight is that, even as adults, we know that tomatoes in a sauce and a whole tomato are the same food, right? They're all tomatoes. Or, you might have a vegetable that's prepared in lots of different ways, but it's the same vegetables. Children might view these as a lot more different from each other. So they might view these as, very distinctly different things, even if you did something like chop it up. And so you might have had the experience of, introducing not even a new food, but preparing a food in a slightly different way and your child doesn't eat it. And you say, well, but you like this version of it. One reason why children might be less receptive to that is because they might see them as distinctly more different, and maybe not understanding or considering the similarities that those foods might have. Okay, so another question that I thought was really great and interesting. And then a third question that I got ahead of time from the group was about an earlier period in development. So this person asked, I have a 4-month-old who's been given the go-ahead by her pediatrician to start experimenting with solids. I'm curious about the latest research on how food preferences are guided by first exposures, such as baby-led weaning versus puree feeds. I'm going to tackle the first exposures part first, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about the baby-led weaning part, because I thought that was a really interesting question. Okay, so in terms of first exposures, these can certainly influence our food preferences. And this might make a food that otherwise wouldn't be as familiar to us feel more familiar. So maybe, getting us on the fast track to liking that food. Okay, so one way this has been studied is by looking at mothers' diets in particular and seeing if that has an impact on their baby's receptiveness to different foods. In particular, flavors that were exposed to babies during either pregnancy or breastfeeding. Okay, so in this study, they recruited a sample of pregnant women, and they gave some of them carrot juice to drink. And they did it in a couple of different ways. So one group of participants was given that carrot juice to drink during their last trimester of pregnancy. And another group was given that carrot juice to drink during the first months of lactation. And then a third group wasn't given any carrot juice. And then later on, when babies were born and were a little bit older, I think around 6 months, around when they're starting to eat solid foods for the first time, babies in all three of those groups were given carrot flavored and plain cereal. And so what they were interested in is whether babies who had been exposed to that carrot flavor, either if their mom drank carrot juice during their last trimester of pregnancy, or if they drank carrot juice during the first month of lactation, if babies would eat more of the food or be more receptive to that food compared to this control group that didn't get carrot juice. And so what they found is that babies in these two groups who had had some exposure to that carrot flavor demonstrated more positive facial expressions when they were eating that carrot flavored cereal compared to the control group. They didn't necessarily eat more of the food, but at least in terms of a measure of liking that you can get from a baby, their kind of facial expression while they were eating, they seemed to find it a little bit more pleasant than babies who hadn't gotten that exposure before. So it seems that there's some aspect of those flavors are getting through to them even before they've eaten it in the solid food form. Okay, so that suggests that, you know, certainly these early exposures can be influential for developing these early food preferences. And the second part I wanted to talk about is this baby-led weaning part of the question. So if you're not familiar with baby-led weaning, this is a feeding strategy that kind of avoids pureed foods. And when babies are first being introduced to solid foods, they're just introduced to those specific foods without pureeing them and kind of letting the baby explore those foods on their own. So they're not being spoon-fed necessarily, and they're not eating purees. And so there hasn't been a lot of systematic research on this. I think this is a pretty new area that researchers are just starting to take a look at. And one thing I would kind of maybe highlight about studies on this topic that's I think important to keep in mind is that baby-led weaning isn't quick, right? So if you've interacted with a 6-month-old baby, you know that they eat pretty slowly. And especially if they're kind of picking up the foods themselves and eating them, like maybe they're exploring the foods more than actually eating them. They might be eating a little bit of them, but they're kind of just experiencing the foods, like touching them and manipulating them, but only some of it is actually getting in there. Whereas a puree, it's a lot faster to feed your baby that way. And so it's not easy to do or quick. And so families who choose this method could be different in key ways from families who don't choose this method. And so I think that's always an important thing to keep in mind about any area of research, especially around diet and nutrition. There could be some important differences just to keep in mind between people who are in different groups if the groups aren't being assigned to them directly. Okay, I did find one available review paper about this. It's by actually one of my former colleagues when I was a researcher at the University of Michigan, Megan Pesh. She's really interested in this area. And so she has a publicly available review about this. But I just wanted to highlight a couple of points that the authors raised in this paper. So they had a few tips around kind of how to go about this process. Some of those were in terms of timing. So when is the right time to start the process? And the paper recommended consulting with a pediatrician, which it sounds like the person who asked this question has already done. Another is to minimize choking risks. So, choose the foods that you're going to offer carefully. And then, make sure that you're ensuring adequate energy and iron intake. And so during the first months of this, you might have to offer the same volume of breast milk or formula because what your baby might be doing more than eating is just kind of manually exploring those foods. So you want to make sure they're still getting sufficient nutrition. And then another thing that they emphasize is to just encourage relaxed family meal times, which is something that as much as is possible, I would encourage in any situation. Okay, so before I get to some of the other points I wanted to highlight is I wanted to take a look at more of your questions since I see them coming in the chat. So I'm going to stop sharing for now and take a peek at some of these questions that you all have brought up. I do know, okay, so here's a question from that Naveen had posted. I have a 4-year-old and then 3-year-old girls. They will not eat meat. I think it might be a texture issue. Yeah, texture is definitely a key feature of foods that children find very important. So anytime you think that there might be an issue in terms of the textures that your child is eating, I know this can be something that's another challenge. As much as you can, try and mix it up or find another way to introduce protein into their diet, right? So meat might not be, if they have a texture issue with meat, I might try something else like maybe beans that have a different kind of texture. Okay, here's a question from Jessica. Does this developmentally normal picky eating period predict any negative health outcomes later on? I would say many studies don't find negative health outcomes later on. Sometimes picky eaters tend to have lower weight than less picky eaters. This makes sense. If you're pickier, maybe you're not eating as much food as kids who are less picky, who are willing to eat lots of different foods. There have actually been some studies that suggest that encouraging kids to eat a diverse diet actually also encourages them to eat more food, because we're not always that great at portion size, right? So if you're eating lots of different foods, you might be eating more food overall compared to if you eat just a few foods. And so as far as I know, this developmentally normal picky eating doesn't tend to predict negative health outcomes later. I would say if kids are on the more extreme end of that normal picky eating, there might be some concerns about not getting enough like vitamins and nutrients, but I think that's pretty rare and is the kind of thing, that's the kind of thing that your pediatrician would get concerned about. Erica wrote in, my daughter is 8 and still very picky. She won't even try new foods. I know that can be a really stressful experience. And so I hope that maybe some of the strategies that I mentioned might be helpful. It could be that you've already tried all of those strategies and you're like, well, now what do I do? That's definitely a tricky area when they won't try new foods and you feel like you've tried everything that you can try. I know that at least anecdotally, like not from a research context, there have been cookbooks and ways to try and kind of hide vegetables in foods that kids are willing to eat. So with things like, making a vegetable puree and then kind of like hiding it in something like something like a sauce where maybe kids wouldn't notice it. I had thought about doing a research study about this and tried out a little experiment at my house where I went through one of these recipes to see how difficult it would be. It was kind of challenging. Like making a puree was a big pain. It made a huge mess in my kitchen. I used like every kitchen implement that I had. And so I found that maybe not a very practical solution for a lot of people. I would say, to the extent that if you haven't already, to try and get them more involved in the preparation process, that might be helpful. At 8, there might be more things that they can do independently. But I think that can be that's a big challenge for a lot of people for sure. Okay, let's see, let me get another one. I think I saw a question about things that are kind of going on right now. So Minda submitted a question. My son is 12 and still eats like he's 4. I worry I worry because he's gaining weight, and I know some of that is COVID and being home pretty much all day long. That's definitely something that I've been struggling with myself. One thing that I've certainly found is that even though I'm at home and eating at home and preparing all, almost all my meals at home, I feel like I've been eating more healthily than I ever have. I certainly gained weight during this period, and I think part of it is not having the same level of physical activity that I had previously, right? Like even just walking around at work, those are steps that are absent since I sit here at my desk a lot. So I think, that's certainly a separate issue of the kind of physical activity and the relationship between that and health. And then also just like stress. Stress isn't good for our health in a lot of ways. This is a stressful and anxious time. And certainly our children are not immune to that. They're feeling the loss of a lot of routines, and that is creating stress. And those experiences are things that help us put on weight and keep it on. And so that can be really challenging. And so it sounds like you've already done a lot of the kinds of things that I, recommend, like trying to sneak in some vegetables, modeling that eating yourself, like you describe yourself as a healthy eater. You've tried to get him involved in making meals. That's not helping either. And so I think that can be one of the most challenging things, is when you feel like you've pulled out every tool or trick that you feel like you have, and they still really aren't, and kids still aren't really being receptive to it. I think this might be an area where I might try and encourage like building on things that they like, but this seems like maybe a little bit more challenging, because I think just like blending up some spinach and like sticking it in some macaroni and cheese is like maybe not going to help in this case. But I would say even if there's any vegetable that is appealing, that's a place where I would start. Let's see. Okay, so here's another question. What's my opinion of kids' weight gain and parents trying to help with the issue? I think this is a really good but challenging question, because on the one hand, we don't want to be overly concerned about children's weight gain. Like certainly in childhood, weight gain is normative, right? It's like part of that growth process. And sometimes kids aren't growing in a linear way, like their height and their weight aren't always matching up. And it's hard to know like when to be concerned and when to kind of when to step in. I think that, but at the same time, it's not something that we want to just completely ignore, because once you've put on weight, it's really difficult to take it off. And that's true kind of at all stages of development, not just something that we experience as adults, but even for, children who are on, a track of gaining weight. This is something that is associated with higher risks of weight gain and obesity later in life too. And so I think that that's kind of what makes it challenging, is kind of finding the right balance between, certainly you don't want to not be concerned at all, but what it means to be overly concerned is a little bit unclear. And so I know some of my colleagues have done some really interesting research around restriction behavior, particularly among sweet foods. And a lot of what they find is that a lot of what they're looking at is like different kinds of restrictive talk that parents give. But I think there are a couple of points that I think are important to keep in mind. One is that weight isn't a perfect health indicator, right? So it's important to also be looking at other kinds of health indicators, right? Like things like sugar levels, activity levels, kind of more specific than just like a weight number. That's one thing that I would say is important. Something else that I would say is important too is it's a lot harder to restrict eating of things that you already have in the house, right? So once it's in the house, that's where I think you can find a lot of challenging kinds of conflicts that come up. So I would say, you know, as much as you can, like keep things that you don't want your kids to eat out of the house. But certainly as kids get older and they, again, are interacting more in peer contexts and, well, not so much right now, but, you know, have a lot more agency in their food choices besides just what you offer to them. I think that becomes a lot more challenging. Okay, let me take a look at some more questions. One person asked if I have any experience with food protein induced enterocolitis syndrome. I'm just going to say that I do not have any experience with this. It sounds like a really scary, and this is a question from Jamila, a really scary and stressful experience that you had. And so, yeah, I'm just going to say that I have no experience with that. But anything that kids are kind of expected to grow out of in a certain period of time, I think could be a really stressful experience for parents because, you know, even if you know that it won't be like this forever, you know, 3 years of any kind of stressful food situation is a long time. And so, you know, I certainly feel for you dealing with that. Okay, so Laura asked, should I be feeding my child 3 meals? She's very keen to eat snacks, but she'll eat nothing at meals, even if she hasn't eaten snacks. I don't know that there's a lot of research about the specific timing of meals versus snacks, or the extent to which it matters if you're kind of organizing kids' meals into, or, you know, kids' food intake into those kind of 3 periods. One thing that I would emphasize, especially during this time, is that kids have really struggled with the loss of structure that they've gotten from school. I mean, if you're a parent, I don't have to tell you that. You've experienced, you know, what it's been like for your kids during this time. So to the extent that having kind of regular meal times, whether it's 3 meals specifically, or, you know, if you're feeding them the same foods at like a snack time as you would at a meal time, then I think the timing of it isn't as critical. But I think having a routine, especially now when kids have lost so many routines, is important. I think if what you're asking is about like snack foods versus the kinds of foods you would be serving at mealtime, I might have a slightly different answer in that context. But I don't know that it necessarily matters specifically if those meals are like clustered into those 3 typical periods from like a food intake perspective, as opposed to the importance of, you know, having just a regular schedule, especially during this time when kids have lost that in so many other areas. I will say, from the perspective of, say, like eating lots of little meals as opposed to big ones, I think that point still holds about, like, sometimes we're not good at portion size, right? So if we have lots of little meals, it might be easier for us to eat more food overall compared to if we kind of clustered it. But if that's something that you're careful about, then that I think that would be fine. Yubi, can you remind me how much time we have? Do we have a specific end time?
We end usually at 1.
Okay.
If you want to answer, I think we have time for another question. Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to I wanted to make sure we didn't run out of time. I had a couple things that I wanted to also highlight with everyone, and then I'll come back and maybe get to one more question. Okay, so let me just put my slides up again. I wanted to highlight some resources that our lab has and also from our partner labs here at UNCG. So we have a lab Facebook page. Every week I put up something called class notes. It's usually taken from something that I'm teaching about in my classes, but maybe something that I thought parents might be interested in. We have that as a regular feature. And then we also have some introductions to our team as well. So if you're interested in more of a behind the scenes look at the research process and getting to know the students who help us out with these projects, we have those features on our lab Facebook page. So it's just UNCG Dev Culture Health. If you're interested, you're welcome to follow us there. Our partner labs also have their own Facebook pages that have some really great content. So the Duck Lab and the Young Minds Lab are also two developmental psychology labs at UNCG, and they have a lot of activities for families to do at home as well. So things like crafts, being an animal detective. So if you check those out, if you're interested in some activities that you can all do at home with kids, those are all on those pages as well. I also have a lab website, and so we have different kinds of events and resources that we might post from time to time. So we'll have book reading. We have some book reading videos that are up right now. And then I try to spotlight some community partners that I think are doing some really interesting work or might be helpful resources. We also have online studies going on right now. So a couple of them are related to food. So kind of what kids think about different kinds of foods when they're older. We've been doing some meal observations at home for younger kids. And then I also have a study totally unrelated to this topic about how kids think about, people getting sick, what kinds of guesses they make. So if you're interested in signing up for those or any other studies that our partner labs are working on, we have a sign up link on our website. And I think it's also highlighted on our Facebook page in case you'd be interested in that. I also had a couple of recipes that I put together that we'll send out. They'll be part of a PDF that everyone will get later. These are some lunch and dinner recipes that I've been working through, especially during these pandemic times, trying to reduce food waste. This at-home lunch is something that might be an especially easy place to get kids involved in kind of picking out their own toppings and even just kind of tossing things together. This is literally what I'm going to eat for lunch after we're done today with our conversation. So just kind of looking into the refrigerator and like seeing what's there. I know many of us have been trying to reduce trips to the grocery store and also trying to figure out like now that I eat lunch at home every day, like what do I eat? What do I feed kids? And so this just kind of picks out things that you might have on hand and maybe encourages kids to toss it together. And then I have a chili recipe that is also really flexible, just kind of whatever you have on hand can go in it. And so we'll share these with everybody afterwards. Okay, so let me stop sharing and see. I'll get to see if I can get to one more question. Yeah, so Carmen asked, how do I maneuver through texture? My child won't eat anything mushy, mashed potatoes, applesauce. Yes, for sure, texture can be, as I mentioned, texture can be a big emphasis on what might influence whether children will eat a food or not. So what I wouldn't do is assume that if they don't eat mashed potatoes, that they wouldn't eat some other kind of potato. So if you chopped it up and just roasted it in a hot oven for 20 to 30 minutes, they might be totally willing to eat that, even if they wouldn't eat a mashed potato. And so I think sometimes, kids thinking about foods as these distinct things can help us in that sense. So if they don't eat the mushed up version, they might be perfectly happy to eat the raw cut up version. But sometimes it can be challenging, right? Because if they eat one thing, you might think, oh, they'd be perfectly happy to eat this related thing, but that might not be true. So that's what I would emphasize. in that case. But yeah, certainly texture can be a big influence on whether kids are willing to eat a food or not. And even if a food that they like has touched a food that they don't like, I'm sure lots of parents have had this experience, but researchers have looked at this too, and they kind of think about that disliked food as a contaminant. And that could be because of its flavor, but maybe also because of its texture. So just kind of keep that in mind. And I think that's also something that some kids will grow out of, although I don't know, I don't personally love mushy foods. So some of these things are definitely going to persist throughout the lifespan. And not knowing which one it's going to be for your kid can be a really stressful experience. So one thing that I like to emphasize is, the experience of parents is really important too. If something is causing you stress, then that's another factor to consider. Like if getting your kids involved in food preparation would cause you stress, I would say don't do it. It's okay. You don't have to do it. I want to try and reduce parents' stress, not increase it. So thank you everybody for coming, for asking such great questions. I really appreciate you all taking the time to hear me talk for a while. And I was interested. I always love hearing parents' questions and just questions from my class and community members. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Dr. DeJesus. If you have any questions, any further questions, you can reach Dr. DeJesus. And here is the link. I have just provided her email in the chat box along with the Facebook page again. Or if you have any questions for me or our alumni engagement team, you're welcome to reach out to us at alumni@uncg.edu. And just, I wanted to give you guys a update about one of our most popular events that we have going on. It's our Toys for Joy 2020 Parade Edition. It's today. It's from 5 to 7. So bring an unwrapped gift for your child ages 4 to 16 years of age, and enjoy the parade through our beautiful campus. Our staff will get the gift from your car, and we'll put them in designated areas, so you won't even have to get off of your car. If this is just something that we do every year to bring a little bit of joy to our kids in the community. So again, it's today from 5 to 7 p.m. and you will just do a drive-through. I'm going to provide that link here in the chat box for you to, if you need more information on the event tonight. So that's all for us, from us today. Thanks again for joining us, and buenas tardes.